To understand the magnitude of the Norse achievement in the North Atlantic, one must first understand the landscape that greeted them. It was a confrontation with emptiness. When the prows of the first settlement ships ground against the black volcanic sands of Iceland, the travelers stepped into a world defined by what was missing. Back in their homelands of Norway and Sweden, the horizon was cluttered with verticals, dense pine forests, oak groves, the visual noise of abundant life. Here, the world had been stripped to the bone. The mist clings to jagged rock formations that rise like broken teeth from the earth. It is a place of stark, monochromatic beauty, where the ground itself feels hostile. There were no forests to break the wind. There was no canopy to catch the snow. There was only the endless gray sky and the bruising dampness of the air. For a people whose entire technology, from their ships to their temples, was based on timber, this was an alien planet. Standing on the ridge, looking out over the barren, rocky plains, the settlers must have felt a profound isolation. They were wrapped in heavy furs, standing static against the gale, realizing that their old ways of building would not work here. The wind in this place does not whisper, it hunts. The cold here is not merely a temperature, it is a physical presence. Frost coats the sharp volcanic rocks, turning the ground into a razor. The moss, fighting for a foothold on the basalt, is the only softness in a hard world. It is a wet, piercing cold that bypasses clothing and settles in the skin. The ocean, crashing against the dark basalt columns of the coast, was their only road back to civilization, yet it was also the barrier that trapped them. The sea foam contrasts violently with the black rock, a constant reminder of the volatile environment they had chosen to inhabit. In this landscape, a human face becomes a landscape of its own. Weathered, eyes fixed on a treeless horizon, the settlers had to mentally recalibrate. They had to learn to look at the ground not just as a foundation, but as a fortress. They looked up at the gray, heavy sky, where no branches broke the view. The atmosphere was oppressive, a heavy lid placed over the world. They looked out at the moss-covered lava fields stretching to infinity, realizing that if they were to survive, they would have to merge with this terrain. Even the vegetation seemed to struggle. A single twisted birch shrub, bent double by the wind, clinging to a rock, was a symbol of the island's timber poverty. It was a warning. Nothing stands tall here for long. Their ships, once the masters of the waves, were beached on the black sand, their sails furled. They appeared small and abandoned against the scale of the volcanic plains. Survival would require a new kind of contact with the earth. It began with a hand, wrapped in wool, touching the cold surface of a stone, acknowledging that this rock, this dirt, this freezing ground was now their only ally. If the island was a desert of wood, the ocean was a fickle provider. The settlers soon discovered a strange phenomenon along the frozen coastlines. Massive white logs lay scattered across the black beaches, bleached by the salt and the pale winter sun. These were not local trees. They were colossal trunks, stripped of bark and smoothed by an impossible journey. They were gifts from the ice. These logs began their life thousands of miles away in the taiga of Siberia. Felled by riverbank erosion or spring floods, they had drifted down the great Russian rivers and into the grip of the Arctic Ocean. There, locked in the crushing embrace of the sea ice, they drifted for years, circumnavigating the pole, before the currents ejected them onto the shores of Iceland and Greenland. To a Norse builder, this driftwood was more precious than gold. The grain of the wood, visible in extreme close-up, told the story of its journey: deep cracks from the frost, salt crystals embedded in the fibers, the silver-gray patina of exposure. The settlers became scavengers of the tide. They stacked this gathered timber carefully on the rocky shores, guarding it jealously. Each log represented a structural possibility: a roof beam, a door frame, a pillar. Without this detritus of the ocean, life in the North Atlantic would have been impossible. With this limited supply, they began to raise the skeletons of their new lives. A wooden frame standing alone in a green field looks fragile, almost insufficient. These were the ribs of the house, silhouetted against the sky. The frame did not need to be solid wood walls. It only needed to be strong enough to hold the weight of the roof. The raising of a heavy beam was a moment of heroic effort. The texture of the hand-hewn wood, scarred by the adze and the axe, spoke of the labor involved in transforming a piece of flotsam into a home. Every chip of wood was saved. An old, rusty iron axe head resting in a log wasn't just a tool, it was the instrument of their survival. This dependence on the ocean created a unique anxiety. They watched the sea ice breaking up near the shore with a mix of fear and hope. Dark, cold water swirling around ice floes might bring destruction, but it might also bring the timber necessary to repair a failing roof. The landscape was marked by this scarcity. A fence post made of stark white driftwood, standing in the lush green grass, was a statement of wealth. It signaled that this farmer had enough wood not just to shelter his family, but to claim his land. It was a precarious economy, built on the charity of the currents. With a skeleton of driftwood in place, the builders turned to the flesh of the house. They did not quarry stone, and they could not mill planks. Instead, they looked to the wetlands and the bogs. The material they chose was turf, but to understand its power, one must look closely at its biology. A cross-section of a turf block reveals a complex engineering marvel designed by nature. It is not merely dirt. It is a dense matrix of soil bound together by an intricate network of white roots. These roots are the rebar of the natural world, holding the earth together against the pull of gravity and the wash of rain. The builders developed a sophisticated masonry using this organic brick. They stacked the sods in a herringbone pattern, alternating angles of grass and dirt. This was not a stylistic choice, it was structural necessity. By interlocking the layers, they ensured that as the grass died and the soil settled, the wall would bind tighter together rather than sloughing off. The source of this material was the damp, misty bog. Here, the grass grew thick and the root systems ran deep. Cutting the turf was a precise art. Hands wearing leather gloves would lift the freshly cut blocks, the raw, earthy texture crumbling slightly, revealing the damp, dark soul of the island. As the walls rose, they ceased to look like architecture and began to look like geology. A thick turf wall, with long green grass continuing to grow out of it, blurred the line between the building and the hillside. The wind blowing through the grass on the roof made the house appear alive, a mound in the landscape. The foundation was critical. A low base of heavy gray stones lifted the turf off the damp ground. This stone footing prevented the earth walls from wicking up moisture from the soil below, acting as a capillary break. Above this stone line, the layers of dark turf rose, solid and grounding. The genius of this construction lay in the air pockets. A macro view of the seam between two turf blocks shows how the roots mesh together, trapping millions of tiny pockets of air. This trapped air is the secret to insulation. While a wooden wall would bleed heat into the Arctic night, a turf wall held it. From a distance, the house disappeared. A wide shot reveals a roof indistinguishable from the hillside behind it. In the soft morning mist, the dwelling is camouflaged, protected not by fighting the landscape, but by becoming it. Inside, the experience was of heavy security. The timber frame pressed against the inner turf walls, the damp, dark soil contrasting with the silver driftwood. It was a claustrophobic space, perhaps, but in a storm, claustrophobia feels like safety. It was a living structure. Dewdrops clinging to the grass on the roof caught the light, symbolizing that the house was still biologically active. It drank the rain, it breathed the air, and in doing so, it protected the life inside. To step through the wooden doorway of the turf house was to enter a different climate zone. You moved from the howling, expansive gray of the exterior into the badstoffa, the living room, the heart of the home. The interior was defined by shadow and warmth. The lighting was dim, amber, provided often by a single oil lamp or the glow of the hearth. The wooden paneling, stained dark by decades of soot and smoke, absorbed the light, creating a cozy, enclosed atmosphere that stood in total opposition to the exposure outside. Space was communal. Along the walls ran a row of wooden beds piled high with sheepskins and heavy wool blankets. There were no private bedrooms here. Everyone slept together, a row of humanity creating a collective warmth. The deep shadows and warm color temperature evoke a memory of safety, a hibernation den for the human species. The heat did not just come from the fire. The house was an engine of metabolism. Often, the livestock, the cows and sheep, were housed in a stone barn beneath or adjacent to the living quarters. In the dark, the visible breath of a cow standing still, the steam rising from its flank, represented energy. The heat from their bodies rose through the floorboards, radiating into the room above. The focal point of human interaction was the lamp, a simple stone vessel filled with fish liver oil or seal tar, its small flame casting long, dancing shadows against the turf walls. This was the sun of their indoor universe. Here, on the long benches, the family lived. They sat close together, wrapped in wool, their faces illuminated by the firelight. This forced intimacy was the crucible of their culture. With the storm raging outside, there was nothing to do but work and talk. It was in this dim light that the intellect of the North flourished. An old book or parchment resting on a wooden knee, the texture of the paper illuminated by the weak light, reveals how literacy was preserved in the dark. They read the sagas, they carved runes, they remembered who they were. Ventilation was primitive. A small smoke hole in the roof was the only connection to the sky. A beam of blue daylight cutting through the smoky interior darkness created a God ray effect, illuminating the atmospheric dust and the rising smoke. It was a reminder of the cold world above, kept at bay. Industry never stopped. A loom with wool threads stood in the corner, the warm firelight hitting the texture of the yarn, the rhythm of the weaving, the spinning of wool, the carving of wood. This was the heartbeat of the house. And in the corner, a sleeping child, face buried in fur, warm and peaceful. This image is the ultimate validation of the turf house. Despite the sub-zero winds, despite the harshness of the subarctic winter, the technology of earth and wood created a sanctuary where life could be soft, warm, and safe. However, building with life means accepting death. The turf house was not a static monument like the stone cathedrals of Europe. It was a biodegradable entity. From the moment it was built, it began to die. Rain was the constant enemy. An exterior shot of an old turf house in a downpour reveals the vulnerability of the structure. Water drips from the grass roof, turning the base of the walls into mud. The atmosphere is gray and wet. The house looks heavy, waterlogged, struggling under the weight of the water it has absorbed. Nature is relentless in its reclamation. Green moss and lichen grow thick on the old wooden beams, their roots working into the grain, softening the wood, preparing it to return to the soil. The texture is one of decay, a slow-motion consumption of the architecture by the environment. Eventually, gravity wins. A turf wall begins to bulge and collapse, soil spilling out like entrails, the grass becoming overgrown and wild. The structure loses its geometric shape, slumping back into the organic chaos of the field. It is a melancholy sight, a reminder that human imposition on this landscape is temporary. Once a house was abandoned, it vanished quickly. A wide landscape shot shows a green mound that used to be a farmstead. Now it is just a bump in the field, a subtle outline of a foundation. The history disappears under the grass, leaving only a ripple in the ground. Maintenance was an endless war. Frost heave, the expansion of freezing water in the ground, would crack the walls. A close-up shows the separation of the earth blocks, the raw soil exposed to the biting wind. It required constant vigilance. We see the hands of a farmer repairing a wall, placing a new, fresh green turf block onto an old, brown, crumbling one. It was a cycle of renewal. You could not simply build a house and leave it. You had to tend to it as you would a garden. Inside, the signs of the end would manifest as dampness. Where the roof timber meets the turf wall, rot sets in. Dark organic textures spread, and the smell of wet earth permeates the room. The barrier between the inside and the outside begins to fail. The seasons dictated the life cycle. In autumn, the grass on the roof turns yellow and brown, dying back, preparing for the weight of the winter snow. The house changes color with the landscape, camouflaged even in its dormancy. Inside, the ventilation often failed as the roof sagged. Thick blue smoke would hang low in the room, layering the air, hazing the view of the back wall. It was a dense, lung-choking atmosphere, a price paid for the warmth. And finally, peace. A field of tall grass waves where a house once stood. Nature is fully restored. The noise of the family is gone, replaced by the silence of the mountains. The turf house does not leave a scar. It leaves a memory. Today, we look back at these structures with a mixture of curiosity and respect. In preserved museums, we step into the past. The interiors are empty and clean now, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silence. It is a nostalgic space, stripped of the smoke and the smell, leaving only the architectural form. A modern hand touches the rough texture of an ancient stone wall. It is a connection across a millennium. We feel the same cold stone that the settlers felt, the same rough earth that protected them. The contrast is jarring. In Reykjavik, modern glass and steel buildings reflect the sky, standing rigid and imposing. But in the foreground, a small turf house remains. It is a juxtaposition of the old and the new, the carbon-heavy, energy-intensive architecture of today versus the carbon-neutral, passive architecture of the past. We stoop to enter. The low wooden doorway, worn smooth by centuries of passing bodies, invites us into the darkness. It forces a posture of humility. You must bow to the house to enter it. Looking up, we see the grassy roof against a bright blue sky. The green is vivid, alive. In our modern search for sustainable building practices, for green roofs and thermal mass, we realize the Norse were pioneers. The landscape holds the ghosts of these farms. A wide shot of a green valley reveals faint outlines of ruins in the grass, shadows that appear only when the sun is low. They are the footprints of a civilization that lived lightly on the land. Life persists in the smallest details. A single wildflower grows out of a turf wall, a splash of color against the dark soil. It symbolizes the persistence of life in a harsh structure, the beauty that can be found in utility. A modern visitor stands still, looking at the house. We contemplate the resilience required to live this way. We measure our own comfort against their survival. The camera pans across the epic Icelandic landscape, the mountains, the glaciers, the ocean. No buildings are visible in the wide shot, just the raw materials of earth and sky. We see the world as they saw it, vast, powerful, and indifferent. And finally, we return to the hearth, a medium shot of the embers, glowing low, fading out into the darkness. It symbolizes the end of an era, the closing of the saga. The warmth fades, the screen goes black, leaving us with the memory of the light in the cold.